so I'll open my PowerPoint here, and I have to apologize because I spent a lot of time making a fancy font, which then didn't transfer to this computer. So imagine that there's a really fancy font up there. So thank you. And also let me apologize, my presentation is a little bit image rich, and it will kind of be difficult for some of you over there. So if there's some way that you can squeeze in, great. Otherwise, I'll do my best to help you visualize. Oh, don't think about upside down. Cartography goes any way you want. So thank you very much. This is a big, very exciting opportunity for me. I happen to be fortunate enough to be at one of the very earliest meetings in which this whole project started to come together, and have been fortunate to be involved at several steps along the way. And it's a thrill for me to be here and see it all actually kicking off with all of the people that are here. I don't know how I got picked to be the keynote speaker, but I'll do my best. It's very exciting in any case. It also is sad, not because you're here or because I'm here, but the occasion, the fact that this occasion happens to coincide with a day in which we're hearing a lot of extremely disturbing reports from Egypt, which is the site of numerous books on many of our lists. It's a sad thing to have to deal with, and I certainly didn't want to incorporate current events into my talk, but before I started, I did want to at least acknowledge this unfolding human tragedy in a part of the world that I think all of us care about, or we wouldn't be here. So, in thinking about my talk, I've never actually done a keynote address before, and I didn't know really what to do, especially because we have a very diverse body of people. We've got a lot of scholars that are certainly, any given subject that I might pick, there will be somebody here who knows more about it than me. So what I thought I would do as a safe strategy is to maybe talk about something that I happen to know, which is my own research. I'll give you a little taste of my own research, give you some sense of how my research interests have kind of led me to this larger idea about connected histories, which is the subject of one of the lists, and then to try to give you a sense of how connected histories fits in with all of the other themes. Because if there's one thing that might be missing from the materials that you already have at your disposal and the activities that you'll be engaging with over the next couple of days, it is the way in which the different lists actually fit together. So I wanted to give you a kind of a sense of the larger picture. Okay, so apropos of that, since here on the cover of all of your Muslim Journeys material, you have an Ottoman map. This is an Ottoman map from the 16th century. That happens to be my area of expertise. This is really lucky for all of us. And here is a map that I want to talk to you about today. This is known as the Mappa Mundi of Haji Ahmed, Tunisli Haji Ahmed, or Haji Ahmed of Tunis. And it really has become kind of a superstar of Renaissance cartography over the last 10 years or so. Just to give you an idea of its fame, it has been a part of major museum exhibits at venues such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Freer and Sackler Galleries of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, and the MEC in Vienna. That's all just in the past 4 or 5 years. It's also been the subject of numerous scholarly articles and even a web video entitled The Mystery of Haji Ahmed that you can view at your leisure in cyberspace. So it's quite a lot of attention for a map that was produced anonymously in a Venetian workshop just about 450 years ago in the year 1559. But it's not difficult to see why. There's no pointer. We don't have a pointer, do we? Can I point with this thing? Yes, okay. Very good. So it's not difficult why to see. It's attracted so much attention because this is quite an extraordinary object by a number of different measures. The image is something called an Orontius projection, which is this kind of distinctive heart-shaped world. I'll give you another image so that you can see this better. So this is another Orontius projection of the world, also produced in Venice at almost exactly the same time. This one is in engraving instead of a woodcut, so you can see the image a little bit better. But the idea is that you have Africa over here, Europe over here, the New World over here. And this was a very popular way of showing the world in the years immediately before the development of the Mercator projection, because it allowed you to show the entire world. This is, after all, just a few decades after the discovery of America, in one image with minimal distortion, okay? This is kind of state of the art. Now, on this one, though, Haji Ahmet's map, what I want you to notice, and I know you can't see this very well, but is all around the actual map, we have writing. You have to take my word for it. This writing is in Ottoman Turkish, okay? Now that's quite interesting because turns out, with the solitary exception of a couple of world maps by Piri Reis, he was an Ottoman cartographer who also made this map, which is on the front of your promotional material. With the exception of two maps by Piri Reis that exist only in fragmentary form, this is actually the very earliest Turkish language world map that we have. Equally importantly, it is printed. This is a printed map. You can actually see here these lines. Those are the lines of the original 6 blocks of pear wood on which this thing was carved backwards by somebody who couldn't read it. So it's a technical tour de force. It's quite big. This is just about life size. So it's a hybrid work. It's the most up-to-date Western printing technology. It's in Ottoman Turkish. It's actually one of the very first attempts to adapt Western printing technology to the special requirements of Ottoman script. And as far as I know, it is the very first printed work of any kind in the Ottoman Turkish language. Okay, so that's quite a lot of firsts. It's combining Western technology, Western cartography in Ottoman language, and best of all of this hybridity is brought together in the persona of the author of this work, a fellow by the name of Haji Ahmet, which you might have already guessed. The only thing that we know about him is what he tells us himself in an autobiographical passage up here. He says that he was a madrasa scholar trained in Morocco, originally from Tunisia, who had the misfortune of being captured by pirates, sold into slavery, purchased by a Venetian nobleman who recognized his qualities as an outstanding man of letters, and then offered him his freedom in exchange for help making this map in order to introduce recent discoveries of European explorers to an Ottoman Turkish reading audience, okay? So you can see why this map has generated so much excitement, right? It's kind of, this person is seemingly taken right out of the pages of one of the novels from the list of connected histories, together with this object, which is so fascinating and seems to incorporate so many different elements of the 16th century world. And so it's really become kind of an icon of this new understanding that we have of the early modern period as a period of cosmopolitanism, a period in which borders were more porous and identities were more fluid than they would be in later periods of history. And so it's this new cosmopolitan understanding of the early modern world, and this map has really become sort of the perfect representation of it, which is why it's become so exciting to so many people. Now, before you get too excited yourselves, I can see how excited everybody is. I have to tell you that the enthusiasm for this map is not necessarily shared by people in my field, the field of Ottoman history. And that is because about 60 years ago, the formidable Ottoman philologist Victor L Minaj, you can kind of hear just from his name that he's not somebody to be trifled with. He wrote an article in which he demonstrated that the map we are looking at now was a forgery and that Tunislu Haji Ahmed himself was an imposter. Now, I know, so you're crestfallen now, right? Now, I won't go into the details of his argument, but basically what he did is he read very carefully the text surrounding the map, and he was able to identify several systematic and in some cases egregious errors of grammar, usage, spelling, in some instances basic factual errors that he argued no madrasa-trained scholar of either Turkey or North Africa could possibly have made. He suggested that they were the kind of mistakes that somebody who was a native speaker of Italian, who had learned Turkish as a second language, might have made, and then he went on to suggest a person that he thought might have been the real author of the work. Okay, now, all you need to know at this point is not that I think this argument is right or wrong. Actually, I think it's relatively convincing as far as it goes. The conclusions drawn from the argument I might take issue with, and in fact, we're going to get into that a little bit later. But for the time being, all you need to know is that because Minaj made this argument 60 years ago, people who study Ottoman history and who can actually read this map permanently lost interest in it because they had the idea that it was not authentic. And so all of the museum exhibits, all of the museum catalogs, all of the web videos, all of the articles by scholars, everything that has been produced about this map for the last 10 or 15 years have all been written only by people who have no idea what it says. So it's represented something, but it hasn't actually said anything, okay? So what I decided that I was gonna do was read it, because there is no translation of it. It's never really been published. There's just this article by Minaj 60 years ago, and then it's just been sitting there. So I spent quite a long time reading it, and it is a very strange text, and it has all kinds of problems, and it does definitely seem like somebody who was not a native speaker of Ottoman Turkish wrote it. But it's fascinating to read. And the more I read it and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what it actually amounted to was a systematic articulation of what it means to be a European. This is quite surprising because it's only in the 16th century that intellectuals in Europe actually started to take the idea of Europe seriously as a place that wasn't just a geographical location, but that had its own unique cultural and historical identity that was distinct from Christendom. And you could point to a couple of authors that are older than Haji Ahmed, who had directly wrestled with this problem, but really, you could count them on your fingers. So what this means is that one of the very first systematic articulations of what it means to be European was actually written in Ottoman Turkish. Okay? Now, things get even more interesting when we look at what specifically it says about what it means to be European. So I don't have too much time, and I'll just give you the most succinct highlights that I possibly can. So what I'll do here is I'll read you the actual paragraph in which he gives us a definition of Europe as a continent, okay? And for those of you that know Arabic script, I know this is not very clear, but right there it says Europe, Avruba, which is, in fact, it's, to see the Europe written out in Arabic script is very unusual before the 18th century. It's just something that you don't find. So it's surprising to see it, okay? All right, so here's my translation. It says, Europe. This is the part of the world that they also call Frangistan. This continent is special in that it is small compared to the others, but at the same time, it is more densely populated and more intensively cultivated. The arts and sciences flourish here, and the fighting spirit of its people has served as a constant source of illumination, such that it is more beautiful and secure than other renowned and famous provinces. And furthermore, it should be known that the greatest rulers of all ages have compared this land to the sun, and most of them have ruled from here. These include the magnificent Sultan Alexander the Great, who ruled 918 years before the Prophet Muhammad Mustafa, and 284 years after him, the Empire of the Romans was founded here. And today, in the year 967 of the Muslim calendar, that's 1559, Europe is ruled by His Majesty Suleiman of the House of Osman, Sultan of Sultans and refuge of the rulers of the world, who is an even greater source for the illumination of humanity. Now, for those of you that don't know who that is, that's Suleiman the Magnificent. He's the Ottoman Sultan at the time, okay? Now, when we look at this definition, one of the things that's very surprising is that it's missing a lot of the stuff that we have since come to consider as de rigueur for any definition of Europe. There's nothing about Roman letters. There's nothing about humanism. There's nothing about Roman law. There's no mention whatsoever of Christianity, okay? Instead, the definition here is totally political, and it's based on sort of two things. One is a sense of dynamism and expansiveness in the contemporary world of the 16th century itself, and the other is a claim to the legacy of Greco-Roman antiquity. On the one hand, Alexander the Great, and on the other hand, the Roman Empire. And if you put those things together, you've got Europe. And I hope you notice that by these criteria, the Ottoman Empire doesn't just qualify as a European state. The suggestion here is that it is the most European state, okay? Now, if I had more time, I would go into more details about how this argument is elaborated, and it is very consistent. I mean, it's all the way through the text in different ways. He's trying to show that this makes sense, that Europe is definable in this way, and the most European state of all, by these criteria, is the Ottoman state. But the crux of the argument is that the Ottoman emperor rules from Constantinople. Constantinople is the new Rome. It is the capital of the Roman Empire. And because the Ottomans conquered Constantinople and subsequently conquered many, many other places outside of Europe, from there, that the Ottoman Sultan is the new Roman emperor. That's basically the argument, okay? And it gets explained also in talking about other parts of the world too. So there's one really interesting passage where he's discussing Peru. And it says, the people of Peru once upon a time had their own language and their own religion, but then they were conquered by the Spanish, so now they speak Spanish and they are Christians. Just like the people of Asia Minor once had their own language and religion, but now they have been conquered by the Ottomans, and so they speak Turkish and are Muslims. Very interesting inversion of the way one normally thinks of the Ottoman conquest of Anatolia, which we think of it as sort of these savage barbarian hordes from the east that are overwhelming this pre-existing Christian European civilization that is there. But in fact, if you know your history, it's not completely crazy, because the capital of the Ottoman Empire before they conquered Constantinople was actually further west. It was in Edirne, which is a city in the Balkans. So they conquered Constantinople from Europe, okay? Lots of other little details like that. I will spare you all of them. So now you know the basic argument. So now the question is, what are we going to do about this problem that the person who's writing this is apparently not who he says he is? He's not a Medresa-trained scholar from Tunisia, but an Italian guy who learned Turkish as a second language. Does that mean that what he's saying is not really authentic? Is he not qualified to speak for the Ottomans if he's really an Italian? Well, if you know anything about the Ottoman Empire and the way that it was constructed at this time, the answer to that question is no, it doesn't mean that he wasn't an Ottoman. Here is a map of the Ottoman Empire, and I know a lot of you may have a very, very hazy understanding of even what that is. So just to be clear, it's not the same as the Caliphate. The Caliphate is an empire that was established by the very earliest Muslim conquerors of the Middle East in the generations immediately following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Had its capital in a couple of different places, but that was, it was centered in the Middle East first capital was in Damascus, the second capital was in Baghdad, and it was centered in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire comes much later, after the caliphate has disappeared, and it is centered here. Capital is in Constantinople after 1453, and the center of the empire is in the Balkans and Anatolia, and it's basically the part of the world that used to be the Byzantine Empire. And before the Ottoman conquest was not a part of the Muslim world at all, okay? In the 16th century, it's expanding very, very quickly. And a lot of people in Europe, if you took a poll of people in the know, you know, the kind of people that would appear on MSNBC and Fox News today, they would probably tell you that it's just a matter of time before the Ottoman Empire conquers everything. They seemed unstoppable in the early decades of the 16th century. Now, the question is, who are these people that are conquering everybody? If I asked you to give me a definition of an Ottoman, I could get any number of different answers, but probably the most sophisticated and most consistent answer that I would get would be a Turkish-speaking Muslim. Right? That sounds pretty fair. An Ottoman is a Turkish-speaking Muslim. Well, now I'm going to blow your minds, so get ready. In the first half of the 16th century, in order to be a fully enfranchised member of the Ottoman imperial elite, in order to be a governor or chief architect or head of the cavalry or any of those important guys, or, by the way, the queen mother of the sultan, you had to be a non-Turkish speaking, non-Muslim foreigner. I'll say it again. In order to be a fully enfranchised member of the Ottoman imperial elite in the first half of the 16th century, you had to start your life out, at least. You had to start your life out as a non-Muslim, non-Turkish speaking foreigner. And the idea is that you would come to the Ottoman Empire, sometimes by choice, sometimes as a prisoner. You would convert to Islam. And at that point, because you're a newly arrived immigrant and you don't have any local family connections or local connections to particular regions of the empire or business contacts or whatever, your only loyalty is to the person who gave you a job, who's the Sultan. So you were favored above all other people and you were much more reliable than anybody else. So in that sense, to have somebody who learned Turkish as a second language and is originally an Italian to be speaking on behalf of the Ottoman Empire makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And the vision of the world and of Europe and of the Ottoman Empire's place within it that is espoused by Haji Ahmet in his text is completely legitimate. It should be understood as a completely authentic representation of the Ottoman Empire and Europe and the world in the 16th century. It's not less interesting or valid because the person who wrote it was a non-native Turkish speaker. It's actually more interesting and more valid for that reason. Now, you're asking yourself, why haven't I ever heard of this before? Why is this idea so strange to me? If the Ottoman Empire was European and people in the Ottoman Empire thought of themselves as European in the 16th century, why isn't this something that comes up more often in conversation? That may actually not be a question that you're asking yourself. But it's still a valid point. Why is it that when we imagine the Ottoman Empire, we imagine it in terms that are so profoundly different from the ones that have been set out here? And the answer to that question is that it's precisely at this moment in time that there is a big argument going on, both in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, about what it means to be European and what it means to be Ottoman. And that argument is resolved in both cases against Haji Ahmet. In Europe, this might be a history that's a little bit more familiar to you. This is exactly the time of the introduction of the Inquisition in Italy It's the period of the Council of Trent. We're still in living memory of the expulsion of all Muslims and Jews from Spain and Portugal. This is a time in which Europe is becoming much more intolerant place and systematically expelling all the people that have the wrong systems of belief. It's becoming much, 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 much more difficult for somebody to exist in Europe as something other than a Western Christian. In the Ottoman Empire, something very similar is happening, but for slightly different reasons. There are these state-funded universities popping up all over the place in the Ottoman Empire. And there are all of these people that are studying in the state-funded universities of the Ottoman Empire. They're called madrasas, the state-funded universities of the Ottoman Empire. The people who are studying in the madrasas are the people who are actually not eligible to get all of the really good jobs. Rather than being immigrants and newly arrived foreigners and converts, these are people who are free-born, native, Turkish-speaking Muslims. They're all going to madrasas and they're studying and they're wanting to get good jobs. And they're becoming increasingly resentful of the fact that they are systematically denied access to all of the best jobs in the imperial system. And so what they start trying to do is redefining what it means to be Ottoman according to terms that are much more familiar to us. In order to be an Ottoman, you have to be a Turkish-speaking, free-born, urban, elite Muslim, not a foreigner, not an immigrant, not a convert. Okay? And these people eventually win the argument. So let me give you another example of another map, because since we don't have access to the language of a lot of these things, maps are a really good way of communicating these sort of different worldviews that these different people are espousing. So this is a map from just a couple of decades after Haji Ahmet's map. It's from a very important and famous world history. It's written by a big Ottoman intellectual by the name of Mustafa Alis. And it's sufficiently strange from our perspective that it needs a little bit of decoding. So this is following a Ptolemaic scheme. So instead of continents, it's organized by climes. These are the 7 climes. It's oriented from south to north. So south is up here, and north is down here. This is Constantinople. This is Africa going over in this direction. This is Asia going over in this direction. And if this is Africa, 2 things that are really interesting about this map. This is the Nile River. This is the mouth of the Nile River, so this would be Alexandria. And this is the lighthouse of Alexandria. Okay? But it doesn't exist in the 16th century. It hasn't existed for a couple of hundred years, but now it's being rebuilt, but in the form of an Ottoman minaret. Any of you have ever seen, if any of you have ever seen an Ottoman mosque, the way that you can tell is an Ottoman mosque is it has a minaret that looks like a pencil, perfectly round with a pencil point and then a ridge going around. And in fact, this caption here says, Jami'i Jihannuma Budur, means this is the mosque from which the entire world can be surveyed. Okay, so this is what the world looks like from the top of the largest mosque in the world, the rebuilt tower, lighthouse of Alexandria. Now, a second thing to note, if this is Alexandria, this is Constantinople. Here it says Vilayeti Bosna, so this is the province of Bosnia. This is the last province of Ottoman Europe. And then here, this down here is the border with Christian Europe. And this here says Zulmat, the land of darkness. Okay? So Europe isn't there. It's not even there. It's the land of darkness. Okay? So here you can see really clearly these 2 clashing worldviews. One person who's trying to argue that being an Ottoman and being a European are the same thing. Another person who's trying to argue that they are in completely different worlds, that Europe doesn't even exist. It's the land of darkness. But the critical point is that this is not a Muslim and a Christian that are arguing about this and that are having these opposing views. These are both Muslims. They're both Ottomans. They're both arguing with each other about how to define the society in which they live. Now, it's kind of sad, though. I have so much empathy for this guy, partly because I'm an Italian guy who spent a lot of time learning Turkish, and I still have people saying, you don't pronounce that right. But it's deeper than that, right? Because it's not only that his argument turns out to be the losing argument, it's that we can see in the way that he makes the argument to begin with that he's going to lose. Because he's trying to say that you don't have to be a Medrasa scholar to speak for the Ottoman Empire. But he clearly feels that if he says that and makes that argument as himself, nobody will believe it. So he has to pretend to be a Medrasa scholar in order to speak with authority, to convince people that in order to speak with authority, you don't have to be a Medrasa scholar. Okay? It's a deep, deep contradiction, and we can see that it's destined to not be convincing. Okay? But it's also important to realize that this was not obvious. This future will not be obvious until it arrives. In the first half of the 16th century, the reality of the Ottoman Empire was a completely different one. But it's a reality that has been made invisible to us by later generations, both in Europe and the Ottoman Empire, who reconfigured what it meant to be both Ottoman and European in ways that made it impossible for us to still hear Haji Ahmed's voice. Until now. Now it's been recovered. So, what does all this have to do with the project that we're all here exploring for the next couple of days and that we will all be exploring for the next several months? I think there are several themes that are sort of central to all of the book lists and which also tie directly back into this problem that Haji Ahmed faced. The first one has to do with shared origins or lack thereof. The idea of how we imagine not only the present in which we all live, but the past that brought us to the present. So often, in the way that we talk, even unconsciously, about the past, but also the ways in which our history narratives that we learn in school are constructed, the things that we hear in the media, tell us a version of the past that is this version of the past. They tell us that Islam and the West are separate and have always been so. They inhabit two different spaces that sometimes bump up against each other, but that started in two different places and that are heading in two different directions. But in fact, the opposite is the case. I mean, it's very easy to forget that we all know that the Middle East is a part of the world that is predominantly Muslim now. It's very easy to forget that at the time that Islam first emerged, the Middle East was the most thoroughly Christian place in the world. If you took my history class, one of the first facts that you would have to learn is that during the first 300 years of the history of Islam, actually two facts. During the first 300 years of the history of Islam, number one, the vast majority of people who lived in the Muslim world were Christian. Fact number two, the vast majority of Christians who lived in the world lived under Muslim rule. Think about that. Seems unbelievable, but part of the reason is that places like Minnesota and Germany and Russia and Poland were not Christian in the 7th, 8th, 9th century yet. The place where most Christians lived was the Middle East, okay? So Islam and Christianity come from the same place. And it's these shared origins that are explored in The Children of Abraham, which is a book on the Pathways of Faith list. On one of my lists, you have this book, When Asia Was the World, which is one that I like because it doesn't talk about the origins of Christianity and Islam so much as the origins of the modern world. And his argument here is that rather than thinking about the history of the world in terms of Western civilization, right? So if you took a Western civ class, you'd learn about the glories of ancient Rome, and then Rome falls, and then there's the Dark Ages, and nothing really important happens for a really long time. And then there's the Renaissance, when Europeans rediscover the glories of the ancient Greco-Roman world, and that sets the stage for Europeans to then go out and explore and eventually conquer the rest of the world and establish new empires, right? Instead, in When Asia is the World, what Gordon is arguing is that it's not empires, but rather religions that are the driving force of human history, and particularly in the sense of creating a world of interconnectivity. Because he says that religions are better than empires at creating connections across political boundaries and across very long distances. And so he starts the beginning of the history of global interconnectivity with the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of a period of history that's dominated by the great proselytizing religions, Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. And the interesting thing about this is that if you think about the history of the world in this way, because Islam is in the middle, and because during this period it's the youngest religion, and it's the one that's expanding the most quickly, and it has Christianity on this side and Buddhism on the other, it really becomes the center of the story, as opposed to something that occupies the Dark Ages in between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. And then the final two books that I thought would be interesting to think about in the context of shared origins are from the American Stories list. The first one is a narrative that actually resonates a little bit with the history of Haji Ahmet, who after all was a slave who was brought to Europe. Here we have a Muslim from West Africa who was brought to America as a slave. And in the context of telling the story of this person, it explores the early history of the United States from the perspective of Muslims who came to the United States as a part of the slave trade, and also the ways in which the United States' involvement with the slave trade had an influence on the formation of the political system that was dominated by Muslims in West Africa at the same time. And then from there you have this nice collection of primary sources, which tells us sort of the subsequent chapter of the history of Muslims in America, ranging from, I live in Minnesota, so this one is especially close to my heart, a story of Muslim homesteaders in North Dakota at the late 19th century, to writings of a great American figure like Malcolm X, okay? So you put all of these things together and you really have a comprehensive reevaluation of the ways in which Western history and world history and American history and the history of Islam are actually interwoven rather than subjects that have to be dealt with separately. Okay, second big theme that I thought would be interesting to talk a little bit about. Again, it would be so much better if the font were more impressive. But journeys of becoming. So what do I mean by that? It's not unrelated to the idea of common origins. If the Middle East, for example, is a place that is now the most thoroughly Muslim part of the world and was once the most thoroughly Christian part of the world, what it means is that if you go to the Middle East and pick a random Muslim and dig back in their family, eventually you're going to find a Christian. Somebody became a Muslim. It's not as if there was the first Muslim and then he multiplied and reproduced, and there was the first Christian who likewise multiplied and reproduced separately. Au contraire, there is somebody who became a Muslim. Every Muslim story begins with somebody who becomes a Muslim at some point. Okay, so a lot of the books on all of the lists are dealing with this process of becoming. Sometimes becoming a Muslim in the literal sense of converting, sometimes becoming a Muslim in the sense of embracing a kind of piety that you rejected before, sometimes exploring a different way of understanding Islam. And there are all kinds of different manifestations of this journey of becoming. To give you an example of just three from three different lists, you have these two interesting memoirs, The Butterfly Mosque and Minaret, one written by an American woman who converts to Islam and moves to Egypt, the other written by a woman from Sudan who lives in a very secular, westernized, upper-class milieu, who then moves to the UK. Each one goes through an experience of profound alienation, a realization of their inability to fully integrate into their new culture, and eventually to embrace Islam as a way of overcoming that feeling of alienation. Again, these are two different ways of becoming. One is an actual conversion, and one is almost a rediscovery, which is prompted in a counterintuitive way by moving to the Western world. But interesting parallel stories to consider. And at the same time, we have the story of becoming Muslim, the very first one, which is the story of the Prophet Muhammad himself. And to give you a sense of what I mean by that, this is a very interesting biography written by Jonathan Brown, but a basic story that almost all Muslims know about the first revelation is that when the Prophet received his first revelation, he was terrified. And he thought maybe that he was losing his mind. And so he went to his wife, and he told his wife about the revelation. And his wife went and talked to a relative of hers who was a Christian. And he confirmed for her that these stories were familiar to him and that the revelation that her husband was having was a real revelation. He wasn't crazy. So that's actually the beginning of Islam as a religion in the form that we know it, is the process of the Prophet becoming by embracing the revelation, by being confirmed in his belief by the fact that there were Christians in his immediate environment. Okay, so again, you can see that there are different connections to all the different themes. I don't want to separate these things out individually. Okay, moving towards the end. Another thing that ties together a lot of these different stories is a struggle between old and new. A lot of times, when we talk about a subject like the relationship between Islam and the West, we're often confronted with these perceptions of things that have been relegated to the past and things that are a part of the future. And too often, we speak of Islam as if it's something that is left over from the past, and the Western world as if it's something that is representative of the future. And these are all books that challenge that basic understanding in different ways. In Dreams of Trespass, this is in some sense the most traditional of the three. It's a memoir about a woman who spent her early childhood in a harem, and who then went on to become a university professor, studied in the Sorbonne, published lots of books. And so she's looking back on these very early years of life in the harem. And it's an unflinching look, and it's a negative portrayal. She portrays the harem as a place that is not anything but a place of oppression and something that she feels she has been emancipated from. But at the same time, she complicates the idea that somehow is an emancipation from Islam. For example, she presents women who feel differently about the harem, using arguments both for and against through the language of the Quran. Now, on completely the opposite side, we have this very controversial book, A Quiet Revolution, which is about the veil. Here we have another woman with a kind of similar socio-demographic profile. She's from the Middle East, from an upper-class family, goes to Europe, becomes educated, is now a professor at Harvard. But her childhood was spent in a completely secular environment where women all wore miniskirts and smoked cigarettes, and the veil was something that you would only see on a peasant woman or a servant, and it was considered something left over from the past. And then in the course of her subsequent 20 or 30 years, she saw it undergo an unbelievable resurgence that no one would have ever imagined would have been possible in the 1960s when she was growing up in Egypt. And it was a resurgence that is a global resurgence that you see in Egypt, that you see in Europe, that you see in the United States. And so she's trying to explain how this happened, how this thing that wasn't supposed to happen, how the veil that was supposed to disappear as a vestige of the past has in fact come back stronger than it ever was before. Her argument is that it has become a tool of a particular kind of emancipatory politics that is empowering Muslim women to be able to act as political agents of political change in a way that they never would have been able to otherwise. A very controversial position, and one that is very interesting when you put it in juxtaposition with something like the argument in Dreams of Trespass. And the final book here is a very different one, and it's one that, if there's one book on any of these lists that is there because of me, it's this one. It's not an easy book to read. And it's for that reason that I think maybe there was some resistance to include it, but I really think it's worth it. It's challenging because it's many, many things at the same time. It's a memoir, it's a work of history, it's a work of ethnography, it's a travel narrative. It's not written by a Muslim, and it's not about Islam per se. But instead it's about the problem of knowing and belonging in a world of constant movement and constant change. The author is born in India, spent parts of his childhood in Iran, in Sri Lanka, went to graduate school in England to study social anthropology, and then goes to learn Arabic and do field work in this tiny town in Egypt. And is completely disoriented by this experience. And then, by chance, he comes across these historical documents from the 11th century that are the personal letters of an Egyptian Jewish merchant. They're written in Hebrew alphabet, but in Arabic. And looking through them, he comes across a chance reference to this man's slave, who it turns out was an Indian, like himself, who had been brought to Egypt 1,000 years before, and who eventually becomes friends with his master. And their relationship grows into something like a business partnership. And he follows in the footsteps of this elusive character, this slave from the 11th century. And it's a journey that takes him all around the world, and it eventually gives him a new sense of his own identity in the modern age by having reconnected with a cosmopolitan, distant past that he never would have imagined could have possibly existed. So, I'm nearing the end. But one of the things that is so powerful about Amitav Ghosh's book for me is that he really brings to the fore the contradictions that are inherent in being a person who lives in the world of the 21st century, a world that's in constant motion, a world that requires us to constantly move from one place to another, and constantly to be confronted by the contradictions of leaving what you know and entering into what you don't know. And this is really also the central theme of another book which is on my list, which is a novel, but it's based on the life of a real person, Leo Africanus. He's a guy whose life matches in eerie fashion the life story of Haji Ahmet, which we started our talk. He was born in Andalusia in southern Spain as a Muslim. He was expelled from his home after the Spanish conquest of Granada. He spent several years as an exile in North Africa, traveling first as a merchant, then as a diplomat. Then he had the misfortune of being captured by pirates and sold into slavery. Eventually, he was given as a gift to none other than Pope Leo X, and he converted to Christianity, took Pope Leo's name as his new Christian name, and he became quite an important intellectual. His most famous book is a description of Africa, which is based on his own personal travels, and he's called Leo Africanus because he wrote this book about Africa, not because he's an African, okay? And this experience of having been uprooted so many times and finally renouncing his affiliation with any particular place, with any particular cause, and with any particular faith is the main theme of the book. Let me read to you the very first paragraph. He says, I, Hassan, the son of Muhammad the Waymaster, I, Giovanni Leone de' Medici, circumcised at the hand of a barber and baptized at the hand of a pope, I am now called the African. But I am not from Africa, nor from Europe, nor from Arabia. I am also called the Granadan, the Fasi, the Zayati, but I come from no country, from no city, no tribe. I am the son of the road. My country is the caravan, my life the most unexpected of voyages. Now, like Haji Ahmet, whose message was lost because of our inability to consider it possible that one could be something other than just an Ottoman or just a European, I'm afraid that Leo Africanus has also fallen victim to the same problem. These are two portraits of Leo Africanus. The one on, let's see, for you that is the right, is a picture from the 16th century. He was a big cause célèbre in the 16th century because he had converted to Christianity, and so the Pope sort of trotted him about as a victory story, victory of Christianity over Islam. And this portrait was painted in order to show him as a Western European intellectual. Now, what the picture doesn't tell you is that he disappeared after a certain point. Maybe he died, maybe he returned to his family in Tunisia, we don't know, but he disappeared. He didn't stay happily living and working for the Pope. Could be that this painting was painted before that time, so we can forgive them. Anyway, they lived in the 16th century. It's no sense arguing with them. But really, what really makes me sad is the picture on the other side, because this is a picture that was painted for this book. And this book begins with this paragraph. And yet, the person who painted the portrait insisted on making him an African. But the whole point of the book is that he isn't anything. He doesn't want to be labeled as anything. He wants to belong to the road. It's the journey that allows us to face the contradictions inherent in only being one thing and to have insights into the possibilities, the other possibilities of other ways of being that otherwise would never, ever be obvious to us if we stayed in one place. That's the reason why the name of this project is Muslim Journeys. It's a journey that you are all about to embark upon. You will be embarking on the journey not only as voyagers, but also as tour guides, and that is a very difficult job. I speak with some experience, having brought groups of students to Turkey for the summer. And I urge you to remember the theme of the journey, because every time that there are contradictions between books, within the different chapters of a particular book, between the viewpoints that are expressed by different people in the room about those books, that's good. That's the whole point. The point is not to remove the contradictions, but to embrace the contradictions, to see the points of disagreement as opportunities for gaining completely new and profound insights about the past, about the present, and about the possibilities for the future. So I hope it is a safe journey. We've prepared, to the best of our abilities, a roadmap in the form of educational materials, resources, essays, and remember that it shouldn't only be a safe journey, it should also be a journey that is exciting, that is filled with unexpected twists and turns, and which in the end will leave you and everyone else in your traveling party permanently changed for the better after you return home again. So, bon voyage.
Well, Well, thank you so much to Giancarlo for giving us all so much to think about and talk about as we head off to dinner tonight. I'm happy to say that tonight's keynote presentation has been recorded, and that will be available online for viewing in just a few weeks. So if you would like to share it with a scholar who maybe was not able to attend, or some member of your staff who's working on the project with you, others, when you get home, you'll have that option. We will hopefully be able to find a savvy video editor who's able to bring in these wonderful visuals a little bit better than you were able to experience them today. We can have an opportunity to get a different file with the fancy font involved, maybe even. We are going to meet back in this room to start tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And before that, from 8 to 9 o'clock, we will have a light breakfast available out in the hallway and seating right behind where the registration desk was this evening. So we hope that you will bring your site support notebook, the big white binder, with you tomorrow. We will be referencing contents in there during the day. No need to bring your folders with you, but just a final reminder that if you haven't already, please read the essay that is matched to the model program theme that you'll be participating in tomorrow. And hopefully everyone has already read the book that they've been assigned for their session, either A Quiet Revolution or Dreams of Trespass, so that you can jump in tomorrow. And I think that's it. I just had a couple questions from someone out in the lobby. If you have signed up to do a dinner and you'd like to connect with your group, you might want to do that just right after the session in the lobby to make connections to walk over together. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in the morning.